good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, today in this session, we would be discussing on one of the most interesting topics, and the topic is state politics in India. And for this discussion, we have with us in our studios Dr. Himanshu Roy. Dr. Himanshu Roy is professor in Deen Dayal Upadhyay College, University of Delhi. Let's try to grab maximum knowledge from Dr. Himanshu Roy, and let's try to understand more and more about state politics in India. So let's welcome our guest once again, and let's have a insightful lecture today. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Geetika. Today's topic is state politics in India, which is taught in every university of India, from Delhi University to most of the state universities of India, and quite important paper. But let's begin with what is this state politics. We have 29 states and 2 union territories with legislative assemblies, Delhi and Pondicherry. So it comes to almost 31 legislative assemblies. So in each state or union territories, the politics is different. It has its own identity because of the topography, the kind of population that we have, the caste structure that we have, the kind of political parties or the party system that we have in each state, then the kind of economy, governance, administration we have in each state. So that's something identity, unique, and its own identity in each state. The politics plays its own identity, but its relations with the center and with each other states, neighboring states, particularly in more globalized economy, altogether all this constitutes, we call it state politics in India. That is to begin with, that is the definition of state politics in India. It all began in 1887 when the first nationality chambers of commerce was formed in Bengal, North Bengal, Bengal Chambers of Commerce and Industries, and they began to demand or pressurize the Congress, Indian National Congress, to agree to the proposal of federalism in India, and the federalism in India should be premised on the linguistic provinces. So basically, in praxis, that is in practice, the political politics, the practical politics began with 1887 after the formation of the Indian National Congress, when the Bengal National Chambers of Commerce began to pressurize the Indian Congress for the formation of linguistic states. And it continued till 1915, when in principle, in 1916, Indian National Congress agreed for a federal India in principle. Remember, we were still a colonial society. The British imperialism was ruling over us. So in principle, the Congress agreed that when we come to power, when India becomes independent, we'll have linguistic based provinces. But in principle, till then, linguistic provinces was not agreed upon. Only the principle that was agreed upon by the Indian National Congress was it will be a federal structure, and that too under the pressure, not voluntarily. In the meantime, different chambers of commerce, regional chambers of commerce, the South Indian chambers of commerce, etc. had cropped up, and they had begun to pressurize the Congress. The next stage was in the evolution of federalism or state politics was the agreement by the Congress in 1920 that in future, when the federal structure comes into being, we'll have the linguistic provinces. So the premise of the state will be linguistic provinces. This was the second stage in the evolution of state politics in India. Then in 1946-47, when the Constituent Assembly was formed, and they began the process of deliberations for independence and the constitution making, we find that simultaneously the process of partition also begins. And the 2 major chambers of commerce, the Muslim chambers of commerce and the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industries, they had their own conflict of the market. And they facilitated the partition of the country as well. They had their role in the partition of the country. And the two dominant political parties who were contesting for the political power, and Muslim League in particular, which was forcing the Congress for partition, led by Jinnah. And in the situation when the Congress was in power after 1946, the interim government was formed, and the kind of direct action launched by Jinnah began after August, October, etc. So we find that the nationalist leaders of the time, the ministers in the government, they were forced by the circumstances to agree to the partition. So once the partition was agreed upon and the process begins, we find that the demand for the kind of autonomy that the state had enjoyed earlier in the colonial times, and the kind of negotiations that these states were negotiating with the center, there was a change in that. The power structure that was between the center and a state in the colonial times, that power relations changed after the partition. And then in the Constituent Assembly, we find that the Constituent Assembly rejected this power relations or the linguistics principle of the state formation. This was something very strange. The Congress had its own committee to think over the reorganization of the states. The Constituent Assembly constituted its own committee, which also rejected the formation of the linguistic-based states. And then there was Eminent Citizens Committee of 5 people, which also rejected the formation of linguistic provinces and based on the principles of federation, the linguistic-based federation. So we find that once the constitution comes into being, India becoming republic, we had the old relations, but the power relations between the center and the state, there was a change. Almost all the powers were into the hands of the center, and India was essentially a quasi-federation rather than a truly autonomous states, the kind of based on the principle that was based upon the cabinet mission. That is quite important. The cabinet mission was giving a lot many autonomy to the states. Whereas once we got the independence, the kind of relations between the center and the state was no longer based on the principles of the cabinet mission. It means the autonomy of the states was very much curtailed, and mainly the relations between the center and the state were quasi. It means the power of the states were curtailed. Whereas the pressure of the chambers of commerce, now these regional chambers of commerce, after independence, began to exert on the Congress to create linguistic provinces. And we find first time a serious movement erupting in Andhra Pradesh. And first time Andhra Pradesh was created based on the linguistic provinces. And in fact, a commission was formed, a state reorganization commission was formed, which agreed in principle for the creation of linguistic-based provinces. This was the first major victory of the movement. So from 50, we find till now, different regions in India is forcing the central government to agree for the creation of the linguistic-based provinces. And the latest in the demand is the Gorkhaland, a very tiny region nearing Siliguri, etc., forcing the state government to agree to the demand for creation of Gorkhaland as a state. And in fact, we find that till 3-4 years ago, the very first state which was created in Andhra Pradesh, again a demand for the separate state was generated. There was a mass movement, and out of that Andhra Pradesh was bifurcated and Telangana was created. So from 50 onwards, where the principle of linguistic provinces was operational, we find gradually the very principle was challenged. So the premise of the linguistic principle itself was challenged. And ethnic states began to be created in Northeast in particular. And then finally we find Andhra Pradesh itself breaking into Telangana. In meantime, we had lot many states. Haryana was created in 66-67. Then we find 3 new states being created in 2000. Chhattisgarh was one, Uttarakhand was another, Jharkhand was another. So out of the old provinces, which were administrative units created by the colonial estate as per its own historical conditions, they were reorganized, broken into further parts, and now we have 29 states and 2 union territories. So this is one aspect of the creation of or reorganization of the modern provinces or states we have in India, that is 29 states, the latest being Telangana, and the 2 union territories with the legislative assemblies, that is Delhi and Pondicherry. The second part is, what were the politics in these provinces in the decades of 50s, in the 60s, 70s and 80s? Because from 90 onwards, when the globalization began, of which we'll discuss it in the second section of our lecture, we find entirely different changing relations. Till Nehruvian period, we find it was the Congress that was dominating. And despite being a quasi-federation, the state had to a large extent good political autonomy, because most of the chief ministers were the freedom fighters within the Congress, and they had a good relations, they had their own identity, they enjoyed their own autonomy, and therefore these chief ministers and these states enjoyed their own autonomy vis-a-vis their relations with the center. This was one, the political relations between the state and the center. Gradually, after the death of Nehru in 64 and the death of these generations of leaders, the first generation of leaders who became the chief ministers, we find, particularly from 1967 and subsequently in the decades of 70s, there are changes at 2 levels. The elected state governments are being dismissed, that is, the president rule is being imposed. During Nehru's time, let me clarify here or state here, there was not much of a president rules. There were hardly 7 when the president rule was imposed, the first beginning with Kerala, where Nehru government dismissed the duly elected the government of the Communist Party of India, which had formed the first electoral government or democratic government in Kerala, to be dismissed. 67 onwards, gradually we find that in the states, non-Congress parties coming into power. And 67 is a watershed in the sense that in 8 or 9 states, non-Congress parties came into power. Of course, apart from Tamil Nadu, most of the state governments which were non-Congress parties governments lost their majority. There was a instability, and again when the election was held, the Congress came back to power. But this was the beginning, when we find that gradually from the periphery, from the edges of the center, in the states, the non-Congress parties government coming into power. And gradually by 89, we find that the Congress even being overthrown from the center. So from 67 onwards to till 87, 89, for 20 years, gradually the dominance of the Congress party in the states was getting marginalized. The second change in the state politics was that Mrs. Indira Gandhi as the Prime Minister, or even the Janata Party when it came into power after emergency, dismissed many of the elected governments in the states and imposed the president's rule. This was something very undemocratic. It means the duly elected government of the states, which should have been ideally autonomous as we have in the American presidential or federal system, this kind of dismissal was something bizarre for a modern democracy. And this trend continued till roughly 91-92. We'll discuss the political changes after in the second section when the coalition era arrives. The third aspect of the state politics is what were the agenda, what were the issues in those decades, in those years. After the death of Nehru, or when there is a change of the regime, post-Nehruvian regime, we find the governance no longer is on the agenda. Development even as such, as the kind of governance or the development that we have on the focus today, was no longer on the agenda of those years. The most important aspect was the social justice, the land reforms, the nationalization of the banks, or nationalization of coal fields, or something any like industries, nationalization of industries. These were the social agenda of the time in the last 30-40 years, particularly post-Nehruvian, in the post-Nehruvian era. So in terms of agenda, these were the issues. The second was secessionist movement. Many of the states in Northeast were asking for separation, creation of a sovereign state. And fortunately, these movements which were asking for the secession from the mainstream mainland India, they gradually yielded under the pressure of Indian democracy and electoral politics, and they agreed to be part of the Indian democratic process. And salute to the Indian Constitution that was flexible enough to adopt as per the new circumstances of the movements. And those who were at the margin, the people particularly, or those who felt oppressed, they were co-opted by the Indian Constitution. They became part of the modern Indian electoral process or political process. And they were politicized in the modern democratic process. So from the center, from Delhi or major metro areas, gradually we find the democratic process expanding into the interior parts of India, into the peripheral areas. And of course, they were given more autonomy, particularly in the Northeast. Autonomous health councils and such kind of constitutional adaptations and accommodations were engineered through amendments, constitutional amendments, to co-opt these aspirations of these people who were fighting for secession or separation or autonomy. Another important aspect of the state politics in those years were the development of market economy. A capitalist kind of economy was gradually developing, and they were breaking the old social structure, the old caste structure, the old tribal structure, the old family structure. And this breakdown of the old created social tensions. A section of the society felt that distributive justice is not being delivered to them. They are not getting into it. So, a section of the Dalits, a section of the OBC, or an idea of Bahujan Samaj taking over electorally the state power was being thought of. Organizations were formed, movements were launched, so that a section which felt oppressed, or the continuation of the oppression of the colonial times, or the continuation of the social oppression of the pre-modern times were to be challenged. And in the democratic process, in some of the states, some of these leaders, through the electoral political process, came into power. And the constitution adopted them. They were politicized, some of their grievances were sorted out, more reservations were created, fair selection was done, infrastructural facilities were given, more opportunities were given to them. So the feeling of oppression or suppression that haunted them in the decades of 60s or 70s or 80s, find to an extent was taken care of. Then we find a fringe section, a narrow section of the society was launching a very radical social movement, what we call it the communist movement or the Naxal movement, that began in Telangana in 46-47 and continued till 1950, and after Telangana we find again in Naxalbari in 67. 67 was one year which has a very important global repercussions. All over there were students' movement, left politics, Naxal movements, anti-Vietnam movements, anti-imperialist movement. And one of the agenda, as I said earlier, was land reforms or to check the caste oppressions, to link or provide opportunities to farmers to link or deliver their products into the market, that freedom, that opportunities. So that was another aspect of the state politics in India. What was the center-state relations in those decades? Of course, it was not very constitutional and healthy. Many of the states, elected states, as I said earlier, were dismissed. There were elections again, and the same party or a different party came into power. After the demise of the Congress gradually since 67 onwards, in fact the process had begun in 57 itself in Kerala. But 67 was the watershed where from that year we find the gradual marginalization of the Congress in state politics. Of course, there was a resurgence. They came back into power, but in installments. As a dominant party that Congress enjoyed in the decades of 50s and 60s, that was getting marginalized gradually. Then we find the benefits of the land reforms percolating downwards, or the impact of these movements percolated downwards. There was a change in the ownership of land. There was a change in the participation of the OBC and Dalits in the civil services, in the state government. Then there was a change in the participation of these people, general citizens, in the electoral political process. So till 89, we find that from 50 onwards, these almost 50 years had different stages of development in terms of politics in each state. But broadly, a state was moving towards from multicultural aspects to certain degree of commonalities. Certain common elements were developing into it. A state was getting more integrated within each state, then with other states, and then with the center. As I said earlier, the constitutional relations between the center and the state was not very autonomous, not very healthy, but nevertheless there was not much change in the constitution except few minor ones where through amendments, where the protest movements had taken place for autonomy, we find certain adaptations, then creations of new states because of the linguistic movements, then new provisions within the states like hill councils or autonomous councils. These kinds of adaptations took place in the past 50 years. So let me wind up this section of our lecture that till 47, from 1887 to till 47, within the colonial framework, we agreed to the principle of federalism. Number 2, we agreed to the principle of linguistic provinces. But we find that after 46, in between 46 or 48, the Congress government changed its stance. The Constituent Assembly did not approve the formation of the linguistic states, and even the citizens, eminent citizens group did not recommend. But after the formation of the Constitution, after independence, we find that again the movements, including the chambers of commerce, pressurizing and launching the movement, pressurizing the Congress and the government to create linguistic provinces. And after 53, we find gradually the movement picking up, a state reorganization commission being formed, and the linguistic provinces began to be created. Then from 67 onwards, the Congress at a larger scale getting marginalized, and we find that finally by 89, even at the center, they collapsed as a dominant political party. So the next topic we'll take up in the second section of our lecture. Let me come back and begin the contemporary aspect of the state politics. In the earlier section, we had focused on the colonial period and from 47-50 onwards to 89-90 period. From 90 onwards, we will focus on the contemporary state politics, and we will see under different subheadings like operative framework, then subaltern politics or different kinds of movements, then social movements in states that we have, then center-state relations, then changing contours of state politics in India, that is political in nature, then federalization, democratization process, and then the conclusion. So under this subheadings, different subheadings, will complete our paper on state politics in India. But let me begin with this operative framework and what is the contemporary aspect of these state politics in different states. Definitely after the beginning of the globalization, there has been a gradual change in the economy, in the issues of social movements and the demands, and in the politics, in the role of the planning commission. Now we have a Niti Aayog, and all this, the governance, the agenda, the development of infrastructure, particularly in the last 3 years, the focus has been entirely on different aspects. And there is a very positive change in the politics, not only of the center towards the states, but even within the states, except maybe in few 1 or 2 pockets. So, what is the major changes? Now let me delineate with the major changes. Number 1, that Congress lost its dominance. It was a period of transition, and particularly we find the 2 coalitional formations, one led by the BJP, that is NDA, another led by the Congress, the UPA, came into power at different stages of India after 1991, particularly 96-98. And the dominance or the stable government or the stability of the government, central government, was lost. Many of the state political parties in collaboration with the Congress or in collaboration of the BJP formed the governments at the center. Almost after 34 years, 32 years, after 3 decades, we find since 1984 that first time the BJP-led party has formed a majority in parliament, in Lok Sabha in particular. So after 89 elections, 89, 91, then 96, 98, 2004 and 2010 and then 2009, after 2014. So first time in 2014 since 84 we find a political party coming into power at its own. Of course, there is a coalition, that is we call it NDA, National Democratic Alliance. This is one major change in the political framework of the central government, and this has led to a change in the center-state relations. Then we find that these changes are reflections of the social movements that have been going on in different states. Now, what was the social movements different from the earlier movements, or is there any social movement which is different from the earlier movements? If you take into account the recent movements in Delhi and in other parts of India in the last 5, 7, 8 years, prominent being Anna Hazare movement against corruption. Now, this kind of movement earlier was in 74 in Bihar and in Gujarat. Definitely that was against corruption. We find now at a very broader scale a fight more intensely for a systemic change, and the agenda has been good governance and rapid development. The entire demographic population of the country is now youth dominated, 67-70% of the population being youth. And they are no longer on the old agenda of primacy of caste or religion. The caste or the religion is no longer, it seems, in the recent elections that have been held in different states, reflects that these are no longer the agenda in contemporary state politics and even at the central parliamentary election, that is for the Lok Sabha. So this is one major change, once again I am repeating, has happened in the states as well as at the federal election. The second major change that we find is between the center and state relations. Because of the coalition politics, it has become very difficult for the federal government to dismiss a elected state government in any state, because the same party is in power in Delhi as well. So it will be very difficult for a federal government to dismiss a party in the state government which is also a constituent in the government formation in Delhi. This has led to the democratization or political democratization of the center-state relations, or more federalization of the federal structure. From 67 onwards to till 89, we find, particularly during the three regimes that we had in meantime, Indira regime, then Janata regime and Rajiv regime, that is the Congress regimes, two prime ministers of the Congress, and then Janata, we had a lot of dismissals of the state governments duly elected through electoral process. So this has stopped almost. Of course, judiciary, Supreme Court in particular or high courts in particular are coming very hard on the dismissal of the duly elected state governments. Now there are constitutional judgments, judicial judgments to follow the procedure. This is one major change, the political, the judicial, and between the center-state relations. The second is the agenda. As I just referred earlier, the agenda is no longer the primordial. The agenda is more the governance, which has secular agendas, the governance, the development. The third part is that in lot many of the states which are littoral states, for example, Bengal, bordering on Bangladesh, or Tamil Nadu, bordering with Sri Lanka. Now the state governments are having their say in the making of the foreign policy. Earlier it was not so. And despite being different political parties ruling at the center and in the states, earlier the Congress was ruling in pre-67 in most of the states as well as at the center. Now different political parties are ruling at the two different units of the constitution, and still they are on board in the making of the foreign policy. So this is third important aspect that we find on the agenda: democratization and federalization, apart from the governance and development. The other aspects is this, that once the market economy and the globalization expanded more intentionally, with intensity in the last 25-30 years, since 91, we find that more villages are being linked with the state capitals, with the district headquarters. There is a more mobility from the different regions or across the regions. And as a result of this mobility, more youth are getting opportunities. Diverse kinds of jobs opportunities have opened up, which were earlier in 70s or in 80s were not there. Now we find a different kind of job opportunities and opportunities for the different kinds of people. More literacy. These are the parts of development and the part of the infrastructure that has facilitated, the development of the infrastructure has facilitated this kind of opportunities for the young population, population on the margin, population at the periphery or the border regions, which were earlier such opportunities they didn't enjoy. The next aspect is that there is a commonality, more integration among the states, more coordination between them. But unfortunately, one very serious issue has emerged, which was earlier not so much, and this is terrorism. Of course, a state has taken many aspects to counter these terror measures. Even the federal government, they have now their own centralized agency. But this is unfortunately in many of the states, we find terror activities taking shape. Earlier it was a different kind of, in very few pockets of Northeast. In 80 we find emerging in Punjab, but an isolated region if you take into account entire India. But now we find after 91, in many of the states, terror activities. This is something very unfortunate, and we may expect that in coming years, this activities or this kind of acts will subside gradually. The next on the agenda is social movements. What kind of social movements we have in the states? As I said earlier, referred to, that one is against corruption, the Anna Hazare movement that we say. But then there are other micro movements, movements for environment. Earlier we had one, for example, Chipko in now Uttarakhand. But this environmental movement or micro movement in different kinds, under different guise, whether in Goa, whether in Tamil Nadu, whether in hills, whether in Northeast, these environmental movements for the protection of environment is one which is very secular now and very universal kind of things which affects everyone. This is not concerned with the caste. This is not concerned with the religion. But this is concerned with the entire humanity or entire citizens of India. So this kind of movement we find taking place in many of the states and making the governments sensitive in the policy formulations and making the citizens aware. Another kind of movement we can say is, for example, right to information, which has made the functioning of the government very transparent, or we are moving towards transparency. So, right to information is making the government efficient, transparent, and making the citizens aware how the government or the administration functions. The other kind of micro movements at a smaller level are, for example, cleaning the rivers. Our rivers are very polluted. So such kind of movements, which were not so much concerned to the wider audience, is gripping, of course, in installments, slowly, different states and their residents, irrespective of the topography, irrespective of the size of the population or the density of the population. This is one area that we find which is taking place after 91. Now the center-states relation, as I referred to earlier, has become more cordial, more democratic, more federal. Now we find that regular panchayat elections taking place in most of the states, and in many states the seats are reserved for the women, beginning with Bengal, say 20% reservations. Then in Bihar, in many of the states, we find seats in panchayat being reserved for women and different poor sections, which is again a grassroots democracy is being promoted, and there is a awareness, social awareness in different sections of the society. Then what is the changing contours of a state politics in India? As I said earlier, that contemporary state politics in India is gradually moving towards more democratization, more opportunities for the young and others, more safety for its citizens. We are more concerned with our safety, and we had a series of movements as well in Delhi that we witnessed a couple of years ago, where the young population fought peace battle against the government for the safety security of its citizens. So these are the changing contours that we find away from the identity politics. In fact, the identity politics is no longer on the agenda. Land reforms are no longer on the agenda, which were earlier in 60s or 70s. Because the market economy is creating two kinds of parallel trends. One, the fragmentation of the land over the population growth. Then the density has grown so high that the per family unit cannot be fragmented now. So this agenda is no longer on the agenda of political parties. The other agenda is opportunities for jobs, and the kind of young population that we have, that is the prime agenda for the jobs. This is basically, again, as I said earlier, federalization or democratization of Indian polity. Now let me slightly explain this in the terms of political parties. We find that broadly in the states, we have three kind of party systems, because we are dealing with the state politics in India. One is the bi-party system. Roughly there are 14-15 states approximately where there is bi-party system. Either Congress and the BJP dominate, for example in Himachal, or the Congress or the other party, some regional party dominates. They come into power time and again alternatively. Then there are 8 or 9 states where bi-coalitional party system is there. One coalition, then another coalition, one led by some regional party or BJP, another led by some Congress. And the third kind of party system is where one party dominates for decades, for 15 years, for 20 years. Sikkim is one case, Gujarat is another case. In Madhya Pradesh, we find 3 terms, even in Chhattisgarh, in Odisha. So in some of these states, roughly 5 or 6 in number, we find one party dominating the government time and again, second time or third time. In this such a rapidly changing world, a party coming to power 3 times or even 4 times, a case of Sikkim, of course, a small state with a small population. This is the kind of democratization and federalization that is taking place through the different kind of party systems in India. Now let me come to the conclusion part, that what has happened, in which we will take into account from 47 to till now 17. What are the major emerging trends of state politics in India? Number 1, more democratization, that is federalization, more social awareness. The new agenda of development has emerged, where there is more gender equality, more opportunities for jobs and mobility, more political awareness, different states at the margin as well as at the borders, or different regions, tribes, castes, which were in 1950s or 60s or even 70s, they were at the margins, they felt socially oppressed, they are no longer having the same agenda. The agenda today is rapid development, individual opportunity, mobility, job. The other aspect is from rural to urban. In 70s, in 47, in 80s, we were much more rural. Today, India is quite urban. Even the rural areas, what we call rural areas, is highly urbanized in the sense through televisions, through social media, through mobiles. The similar kind of urban culture has percolated the youth population in rural India. Their clothes have changed, their food habits have changed, their language is fast changing. Earlier, a young boy from Kerala used to have different kind of clothes. Now from Kerala to Northeast or Kanyakumari to Kashmir, we find a similar kind of clothes, a similarity in culture. Now the kind of educational system that we are having at the university level or the kind of educational system that we are having at +2 level, there is a much more mobility of the students, or it's going to have in the future in another 1 to 2 years across different states from one university to another university. This will further facilitate more mobility among the youths. This is another important commonalities that is developing among the different states and between the states and the center. The kind of policies being formulated by the federal government, and very recently from 1st July we will have the GST, goods and services tax, the kind of taxation system that we will have, and in such a very short time this government has able to do it, which was pending for the couple of years in the past. This will change to an extent lifestyle of a large section of people. It will also change the taxation policy or the functioning of the government. So this is another very important commonalities that has emerged in the last couple of years or decades. So India is more integrated now, has much more common culture. The kind of arguments that some of a section of the academics, a section of the political parties state that we are much more multicultural. We used to be much more multicultural. We are still much more multicultural. But the emerging trend of the market and more the linkages of the market with the different regions of India and with the globe, the diversities will gradually get minimized. We'll have more common culture, similar kind of food, similar kind of work culture, similar kind of habits. And this will be better in terms of if we link it with the infrastructure development, which has been lagging behind. So if the infrastructure is developed more rapidly, which any government should now aspire to expedite the whole process, the state politics in India will be much more better for the citizens. Thank you very much.
Okay, sir, thank you so very much for delivering us a very, very productive session. And dear friends, we believe that your feedbacks are very, very important for the lecture and for us, so that we could improve and give you more and more. So do write to us at info.cc@nic.in. The lecture is going to be uploaded on YouTube very soon for you. You can also write your comments at the YouTube itself. So dear friends, we would be meeting again very soon and would be discussing on another topic. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.